Stitch by Stubborn Stitch. The Secret History of Abigail Finch, Philadelphia, July 4, 1801. To my dearest Eliza, to be open when the world is wiser. If this letter finds you, then I am either dead or scandalously old. In either case, I expect my stories are safer now than they ever were in life. I write to you not because I seek vindication, nor even remembrance, but because I want you to know the truth of things, as unvarnished as a Quaker's bench and just as splintered. History is a beautiful liar. Eliza, she powders men's faces and scrubs women from the margins. She turns traitors into statesmen and saints into statues. But I have never had the patience for marble. You know me as your Aunt Abigail, seamstress of respectable repute, occasional baker of cherry tarts, and the woman who never married. You know the parlor stories and the embroidery. What you do not know is that I once helped smuggle the Marquis de Lafayette out of a locked port by dressing him as a pastry vendor, that I stabbed a British officer with a hat pin, that I kissed a redcoat and burned his dispatches, that I danced with Thomas Jefferson's cousin while stealing his pocket watch and he never noticed. But let me begin properly. A seamstress in the storm. I was 22 when the first real stirrings of rebellion began to shake the ground under Philadelphia. I was a modest girl, by most accounts single, parentless, possessed of nimble fingers and a nimble tongue. I tried not to let loose too often. The city was a tangle of contradiction, horse dung and revolution, lace and lanterns, tavern talk and tobacco smoke. One moment, a preacher in the square would warn against vanity. The next, a merchant would be handing effigy for selling tax tea. I made my living hemming coats and stitching frocks for both loyalists and rebels alike. My needles knew no politics, at least at first, but revolution has a way of entering through the seams. One evening in early 1775, a Mrs. Temperance Holt arrived at my shop, cheeks flushed from the cold, and eyes glittering with mischief. She handed me a bolt of navy wool and whispered, "Make it strong, dear. There's more in that fabric than fashion." Inside the folds were rolled tiny scraps of paper-inked messages bound for Boston, stitched into waistcoats and petticoats, worn by women who looked like nothing at all. This was my baptism, a most improper sisterhood. Soon I was introduced to the women of the Ruffled Patriots, a name that began as a jest but endured with pride. We met under the guise of sewing circles, baking clubs, and Sunday prayers. We shared code words and crusts of bread, laughter and lye soap. We were laundresses, printers' wives, brewers, widows, and even one marvelous free woman named Clara, who could forge better than most silversmiths. Our acts were not grand, but they were vital. One of us once redirected an entire shipment of British powder kegs to Valley Forge by switching labels at the docks. Another baked gunpowder into loaves of bread. I became a master of misdirection in my shop. I stitched coded symbols into hems, forged invoices, and passed false schedules to our messengers disguised as midwives or delivery girls. I hid letters in hat boxes and flirted with loyalist officers to glean intelligence, always with a well-placed sigh or a deliberate flash of décolletage. Let no man say the war was won without corsets, the red coat, and the hat pin. Jonathan Mallory was not supposed to matter. He was a British lieutenant from Sussex, with a poet's mouth and a limp he tried to hide. He came in for a new officer's sash one day in 1776, and I nearly refused him on principle. But then he smiled. Lord, Eliza, it's the smiling ones who ruin us. I discovered later that he was quietly disillusioned with the war, sympathetic to colonial grievances, but bound by family and honor. We struck a correspondence, which became a courtship, which became a glorious, impossible love. We were Romeo and Juliet in reverse. I was the rebel. He wore the red coat. It ended, as these things must. One evening, I found a dispatch in his coat, plans for a surprise raid on a rebel supply convoy. He had not meant for me to see it. I burned it that night, along with the bridge between us. He knew. He left the next morning, with nothing but a half-empty teacup on my windowsill. The escape of Lafayette. It was the summer of 1778, when Lafayette arrived in Philadelphia. By then, the Frenchman was already something of a legend, barely 20 years old, but bold enough to defy his king and join our cause. When word came that British agents planned to abduct him en route to Yorktown, the Ruffled Patriots were summoned to act. I designed the disguise myself, a plump apron, a powdered wig, and a rickety cart of glazed buns. Lafayette, who had never so much as sliced bread in his life, played the role with astonishing flair. We wheeled him through the market square at dawn, past two suspicious constables, and onto a hidden ferry that Clara had bragged into silence. As we pushed off, he turned to me and said, in broken English, You are more revolutionary than all the generals. I said, don't ruin it with compliments, Marquis. Just don't forget the women. The reckoning. After Yorktown, the victory bells rang, but they rang hollow for some of us. We were never invited to the conventions. We had no seats in the New Republic's halls. Clara was arrested for impersonating a courier and died in a prison cell without trial. Betsy Ross received praise for sewing a flag, but not for housing fugitives beneath her floorboards. I wrote furious letters to the Council of Safety, to Washington, to Franklin, none of which were answered. Eventually, I stopped expecting thanks. I stitched on. Epilogue, a stitch in time. Eliza, if you remember nothing else of your Aunt Abigail, remember this. History will try to fold you neatly into her narrative. She will give you a hemline and a husband and ask you to smile from the shadows. Refuse, smuggle your defiance in a lace cuff. Stitch your truth into the lining of your life. Tell your story, even if no one asks you to, especially if no one asks you to. Yours, forever scandalous and stubborn, Abigail Finch.